Yes, we are good to go.
Namaste, good evening, and welcome to the 36th edition of Guru Manthan 2020-21, a series of 50 discussions that we've been having with educationists and thinkers. Uh, the Guru Manthan talks are being organized under the aegis of the Vivekananda Institute for Leadership Development, VLEAD. VLEAD is an initiative of SVYM, and VLEAD's mission is to develop human and social capital for nation building. And this VLEAD does by enhancing the potential of individuals and institutions across the development. And VLEAD engages across four sectors: the government, NGOs, corporates, and the community, with a special emphasis focus on the youth. Guru Manthan is an initiative, a platform, particularly during this COVID-19 time when we uh, for teachers to share, discuss, debate, as well as learn about the diverse perspectives and practices in education across the world. We've had a multitude of speakers. As always, the format of the talk would be that the guest speaker would speak for about 25 minutes, followed by a moderated Q&A, which would be handled by both Praveen and myself. And we would also be picking up questions from the chat box. So if you have any questions, please post them on the chat box. After the Q&A session, the speaker would do a short closure, and then that would be the end of the program. So today we have as a guest speaker Dr. T.V. Venkateswaran, who will be speaking on fostering scientific temper and the role of teachers in doing that. Dr. T.V. Venkateswaran is a senior scientist at the Vigyan Prasar and an autonomous body under the government of India. It's a pleasure and privilege to have you, sir, on board. And
Thank
over
you.
to you, sir.
So I can start?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, friends. I'll start my talk. Uh, Thank you for this wonderful opportunity, SVYM. Let me share my screen and then I'll start talking. Uh, my friends know me that I'm a very naughty person. There are some people who say that whatever is the title of the talk the organizer may give, that I'll come and speak whatever I think is the what I want to speak. Okay, so I've changed my title, knowing that no, I'm sorry, organizers. So let me start. Uh, we all accept by and large that dragon is a imagination. It's a fairy tale. There is no real dragon. You may see in Animax, Cartoon Network, children's stories, but dragon is not real, imagination. But dinosaurs are real, but we don't see them around. Okay, you go to a zoo, you won't see a dinosaur, but we accept dinosaur as real. Why? Why do we reject dragon but accept dinosaur? If we can see something, then generally we feel that it is real. But what about things that we cannot see? When I say the word see here, I'm talking about the physical capacity to use our eye connected with our brain, and visual perception. But I actually mean much beyond that. I don't mean only the eye. Any of your sense organs, you touch, you feel, right? So all sense organ, I'm just using eye as a metaphor for it, a shorthand for it. Okay, if we can touch something, we know that it is real, etc., etc., right? But what about things that you cannot see? Let's look at, for example, moon. Moon is showing only one face to our Earth. We were not able to see the other side of the moon. But it's simple. But of course, it took some few thousand years for humanity. But you can build a spaceship. You can send a spaceship on the other side of the moon. You can put a television camera. And as long as you want, you can sit and watch the other side of the moon. There is nothing difficulty there. I don't mean that kind of not visible. Okay. I don't mean that kind of a not visible. What I mean is something more serious. Like say, for example, we are never able to be going to see gravitational waves. You can see the waves on the sea. You have to go to the seashore, you can see the waves. But gravitational waves are going to be invisible. You can visualize it, but it is going to be invisible. Atoms, almost invisible. Of course, today, most modern microscopes are able to kind of show you some structure which we can name it as atom, but somewhere over there. Okay, electrons, neutron stars, they are so far away that you are not going to be able to see it. You cannot feel it. Okay, what about species like dinosaurs, which no longer exist? In modern science, we use these entities, but then we accept them as real. In contrast to dragon, we don't accept, right? We think it is imaginary. Where is the how do we draw the difference? At one level, we refuse ghost, jinns, Kamadhenu. Okay, you will reject Kamadhenu as mythical from the point of view of science, but you will accept dinosaurs. Why so? This is, I think, a very important question to ask. So, what I'm going to talk about is how did science find a invisible? We all know, for example, electromagnetic radiation consists of radio waves, microwave, infrared, what we call as visible region, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays, so on and so forth. Visible region, of course, we can see with our eye, but we can't see microwave, infrared, radio waves, etc. So in this talk, one of the central thing that I'm going to talk about is how did we find one of these invisible from science? Infrared rays. Okay, you can't see infrared rays. Of course, today you can have visualized infrared rays. So infrared ray camera and things of that kind actually visualize, right? So which is very different from you seeing, right? So how did we find out that first of all it existed? After we know that it exists, we can think of developing an instrument through which we can capture that radiation and so on and so forth. But how did we even know that such an invisible thing exists? When you look at the moon, you know that the other side of the moon exists. Whether you can see it, whether you cannot see it is a different question. But you know that it exists. Okay. But how did we even know that infrared rays existed? It's not seeable, it's invisible, right? But how did we even come to know that it exists? So let me start my story. So the story begins with Newton. We all know that how Newton used a prism to split the white light of sun into what in those days they called as Vibjar. Today we know that it's actually Vibjar is a shorthand for saying the spectrum of visible light. Visible light is from about 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. Every single wavelength is different color, blah, blah, blah. All these things we know. I'm not going to get into that. Some of you may not be from science, so don't get hassled by it. It doesn't matter. So let's stick to simple facts that we all know as Vibjar. Okay, let's stick to that. That's okay. Okay, Vibjar. Newton was able to split the sun's white light into the 7 colors using a prism. We all have studied in this school, right? We all know about it. So, first of all, how did we come to the conclusion that the sun's light is actually consisting of these colors? Let's say, for example, water looks like colorless. You put little bit turmeric, it'll become yellow. So, can you say that water is yellow? So, in same way, for example, the prism could have added the color, right? Maybe it is not the property of the sun's light, but it is a property added by the prism. Yeah, when the light goes through the prism, maybe the prism is adding. This is an important question that you have to answer. So what Newton did is not only that he took a prism, passed sunlight and got Vibjar, he did more than that. What did he do first? He split the light, you get the Vibjar. Now what he did was, interestingly, he put back the spectrum, Vibjar, into the prism. He got the white light. So you put a white light, the output is Vibjar. You put Vibjar, your output is white light. This is something that he got. Number one. Number two, what he did was, like the first one in this three, you can see very clearly that the input is white light, you get the Vibjar. When the Vibjar is the input, you get the white light. Then what he did was more interesting. Instead of putting all the Vibjar color back into the prism, only the select portion. When you take the select portion and pass it through prism, you have a mixed color. Okay. And if you kind of very carefully let, for example, only the red light pass through the prism, it remained red. It did not turn into anything. That's the most important point. Okay. That is, in the Vibjar, you take only the red portion and then pass it through the prism. Nothing happened. It remained red. So you knew that it is not something that is being added by the prism, by these experiments. Okay. So this is how Newton came to the conclusion that white light consists of the 7 colors, blah, 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 all those things that we read in school, right? So when he was forming this prism experiment and then getting this Vibjar, something more was visible in those experiments, which is that in between the colors, that is, if you look at the red color and let's say the yellow color, in between, there was a kind of a black line. Of course, today, if some of you have studied physics, you would know that it is something to do with the Fraunhofer line and so on and so forth, which is not the topic of our discussion. I'm not going to discuss. But the point is that in those days, they thought perhaps these colors are being marked by a black line. Okay, so colors are distinct. That is how the idea of Vibjar came in those days. So they had a prism of a particular sharpness. So when you use that prism, you got this kind of a information, right? Look at sunlight. If you let it pass through a prism, you get Vibjar. In addition, if you stand in sunlight, you feel hot. You stand in a shadow, that is where the sunlight is not falling on you, you don't feel that hot. You may feel the ambient temperature, but you don't feel hot. But you stand in the sun, you feel hot. So you also know one more thing. The sunlight is not just carrying the 7 colors, but also is carrying heat, right? Something that all of us know very well. So this is the background of my story. So now the story is going to begin. In the picture, you are seeing 2 people. One is William Herschel. If any of you have interest in astronomy and you have studied bit of astronomy and so on and so forth, you know that William Herschel is the person who discovered Uranus, the planet Uranus. That's how most of the science books will tell you. But whenever we talk about history, remember its spelling. What is the spelling? H-I-S, his. So history is generally his story. Her story usually is hidden. The role of women in history, generally we don't talk about it, but we need to talk about it. As I said, the textbooks say that William Herschel discovered Uranus, but if you really go back and look at his diary and so on, his sister, Carolina Herschel, who remained unmarried, okay, Herschel also remained unmarried, she was collaborating with Herschel, William Herschel, and almost all the discoveries that we today say Herschel discovered was actually jointly done by both of them, Carolina and William Herschel. But our textbook talks only about his story, not her story. And I think it's important that we talk about her story also whenever we talk about history of science. Okay. So, but let me come back to my story. So, William Herschel. So, this William Herschel uh, was using the telescope to observe celestial objects. One of the objects that he wanted to study was sun. Why he wanted to study sun? Because on sun you can see something called a sunspot. So in those days, people were researching about sunspot. So, but if you want to use a telescope to observe sun, if you directly look at the sun using a telescope, your eyes will be burnt. We all know it. After all, telescope has a lens, and then if you focus sunlight on a lens, you know that a paper can be burnt. So your eyes will burn. Okay, so you can't use a telescope directly. So you have to use a filter to reduce the effect. Okay, so he was trying to find out which is the best filter. That was the inquiry that Herschel was engaged in. While he was engaged in that, what he found was very interesting stuff. This is from his paper, which is dated March 27, 1800. So in that paper, he says, what appeared remarkable was that when I used some of them, that is some of the darkening glasses, okay, he was using different color darkening glasses, okay, some red, some yellow, some combination, so on and so forth. So what does he say? What appears remarkable was that when I used some of them, I felt a sensation of heat. Though I had very little light, that is, you felt heat, but there was no light. But when I used others, there was a lot of light, but there was no sensation of heat. That was the puzzle that Herschel inquired when he was using the filters for the telescope. So he pondered about it and then thought, maybe not all colors in the Vib jar is carrying the heat. So he wanted to find out which color is carrying the heat. So once you find out that color, you can filter it out, then you can observe sun without much problem. That was his idea. So how do you find out which color is carrying the heat? Simple arrangement. You put a system like this. Uh, so basically you take a lot of thermometer, arrange them here, you put a slit, and then in the next slide, you will know how the arrangement is working. So you put a slide here, you put a prism here. So the prism splits, and then because here there is a slit, only one color light will go down. Okay, you measure the temperature of that light, and then you keep a control to measure the ambient temperature, so that you know what is the difference between the thermometer kept under the particular color and the thermometer which is measuring the ambient temperature. So the difference will tell you what is the heat that this color is bringing. Okay, that's the idea. I suppose it's very simple to understand. So what he found is that the violet was carrying additionally 2 degree Fahrenheit. In those days, they were using Fahrenheit. Green was 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Red was 6.9 Fahrenheit. So very clearly, red was supposedly carrying too much of heat. Okay, this is how his arrangement was. So let's not get into this. So basically, what he did was that accidentally, when he was performing this kind of experiment, where he kept a different thermometer for each color, and then a thermometer outside the spectrum to measure the ambient temperature. Accidentally, it was just near the red. Okay, where the red ended, he had put this thermometer, which is called as control thermometer, to measure the ambient temperature. Okay, so this was his arrangement, right? So there were a lot of thermometers. Some thermometers were under sunlight. This was not under sunlight. Okay, that's what is the important point. So no sunlight was falling on this control thermometer. Okay, so then what happened? Very interestingly, he found that the thermometer which was just beyond the red, where there was no sunlight, okay, there was no sunlight, it was dark, but the temperature increased by 3 degrees Celsius. It was the hottest. So Herschel was totally surprised. Then he found that when you look at the temperature of the brightness, which color is bright? He found that the region between yellow and green is a bright. That's why we call sun as a yellow star. Okay, that's the brightness. Okay, if you split a spectrum and if you look at the spectrum, the region between yellow and green will be the brightest. But if you measure the temperature using thermometer, what he found was that a region beyond red, where there is no sunlight, no visible sunlight, that is where the temperature is the highest. So this he found. He repeated this experiment in a number of seasons, number of places. Then he came to a conclusion that there should be some invisible light, which our eyes are not able to see, but is the main carrier of heat. Of course, in those days, they were not calling it as heat. They were calling it as calorie. That is the name that was there. So these rays were called as calorific rays in his time. Today, we call them as infrared rays. That's a different issue. But in those days, they were calling it as calorific rays. William Herschel named it as a calorific rays. And he found that this rays follows the same physical principles of light. What are the physical principles of light? Angle of reflection, we know about it, so on and so forth, right? Some principles, some characteristics of light, right? So when you keep a mirror, it will be getting reflected and so on and so forth. The angle of incident equal to angle of reflection and so on and so forth. All those laws were applicable to even this invisible rays. So he said that it's actually an invisible ray, invisible light, which is beyond red when you split it through a prism, right? And in those days, they call it as calorific rays. Today, we call them as infrared rays. So now, for example, through this activity, he discovered, as I said, it was not only he, it's a collaboration, he and she, both of them put together, William Herschel and Carolina Herschel together, discovered something which is invisible, okay, about which we did not even know before they performed this kind of activities, right? We were absolutely unaware that such a thing existed, but then we discovered through this process. Once William Herschel's discovery was known, that we found that there is an invisible ray on the other side of the red. So people started asking question, can there be also invisible ray on this side of the whip jar? Okay, red is on one end, violet, blue is on another end, right? Violet is on another end. So they were asking question that can there be a invisible light beyond violet? So a German scientist called Ritter performed the experiments. He did it in a completely different way. It was also involved same kind of experimental setup, but instead of using thermometer, you use photographic plate. The old black and white photographic plate had silver chloride. Some of you older people might know because we studied about it in our school. Okay, so silver chloride will turn black when you expose it to sunlight. So that is the photographic paper. So he kept the photographic paper and then he found that even beyond violet, when there is no sunlight, the photographic plate turned black. So which means that there should be a invisible layer on the other side of the whip jar too. Okay, today we call it as ultraviolet rays. Okay, in those days it was called as chemical rays, right? But names keep changing, but names doesn't matter. So today we call it as ultraviolet rays. Same way, for example, people found X-rays, so on and so forth. Then finally, Maxwell predicted from theory that there should be radio waves, and then Hertz actually discovered the radio waves. I'm not going to talk too much about it. Through this, we knew about the whole spectrum, except for visible light. Remember that none of the other areas of electromagnetic spectrum is visible. Okay. So this brings to my question. Compared to, let's say, dragon and dinosaur, dinosaur has some evidence, but dragons does not have any evidence. Look at what kind of evidence. Why do we believe, for example, that there is infrared rays? When you teach science and your science teacher tells you that there is infrared rays, why should you believe? I can't see it, right? So why should you believe? So this brings in a very important question of what is scientific temper and what do we do about it in our school. Okay, so let's be go forward. So when we talk about teaching, we want children to know, right? So knowing, knowledge is what is important. So when can you say that I know something? Suppose, let's say I have a parrot and I train that parrot. So whenever you go to the parrot and ask a question, what is the shape of Earth? The parrot replies that spherical. Can you say that the parrot knows the shape of Earth? I'm sure we all won't agree. Suppose I train the parrot. Whenever you go and ask a question, what is 3 plus 5? The parrot answers 8. Okay. For that question, 3 plus 5, the parrot answers 8 because I have trained it. Can you say that the parrot knows addition? I'm sure you will agree it's not true, right? So when do we know? When can we clearly say that we know? We can say we know only when two conditions are satisfied. What are those conditions? First condition is we know how we come to acquire that knowledge. We here means humanity. We as humanity come to acquire that knowledge. What was the experiment? What was the data? What was the exploration? What was the procedure by which we come to that knowledge? That we should be aware of. Second, why that claim is reliable. That is, what are the evidences? And do those evidence warrant us to accept that claim? These are the two important questions that we should be able to answer. Right? How do we come to acquire the knowledge? Why the claim is reliable? Now let's go back and look at, for example, infrared rays. How did we come to acquire that knowledge? I explained you. Okay, step-by-step procedure. In particular, the experimental setup of Herschel's Carolina and William, putting thermometer in different colors, blah, 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 and then checking out. Okay, so how we come to acquire that knowledge. Is the claim that there is an invisible ray beyond red is acceptable? Yes, we can very clearly see, that evidence clearly say that there is some kind of ray. Whatever name we give, that's not a important point. There is some kind of a ray. We can accept, right? As a rational human being, all of us can accept, right? So this is one of the central important point of scientific temper. So when we talk about knowledge, we should be able to say why we know, or rather why we accept that we know. Let me come to the scientific temper in our constitution. So the constitution says to develop the scientific temper, humanism, and the spirit of inquiry and reform. In my considered opinion, we should not separate out scientific temper, humanism, and the spirit of inquiry and reform into three separate stuff. In my opinion, they are all interlinked, and we need to see them as interlinked. That's what this class, in my opinion, mean. What does it mean? When we say scientific temper, I have hundreds of beliefs. For example, I'm right now wearing a particular t-shirt. Why did I buy this t-shirt? Because I thought I look nice in this t-shirt. Or maybe my wife told that you are looking nice in this t-shirt. That's why I bought. But do I have proof for it? Did I conduct an experiment? Did I go out and ask 100 people and say that, do I look good in this? No, I did not. That's my private belief. Okay, that's my private belief. But then when we talk about infrared rays, it's not a private belief of Herschel's, right? It's a public belief, right? So in belief, there are two kinds, private and public. Are we able to distinguish between these two? That's, I think, very important point. Second, when we talk about society, when we talk about interacting with each other, when we're talking about we living as a group, public rationality, that is arguments based on what is public knowledge. Your private knowledge still exists. You may live with it. But why should I live according to your private knowledge? But we both can live according to our public knowledge, right? Public means you are also part of it, I am also part of it. So the scientific temper plays a very important role in what is called as public rationality. So today, for example, should we give vaccine or not? That's a public rationality question. Do vaccine save human being? Do vaccine protect? What kind of protection it gives? Maybe it has some side effects. So whether the positives of vaccine outweigh the negatives. These are all public rationality questions. Okay. As an individual, you may choose, you may not choose, but it's your private matter, right? I may talk to you about it, but that's still your private matter, right? Because it's your body. But as a public policy, should we have a vaccination drive or not? That is related to public rationality question. Similarly, when we talk about humanism, what does it mean? It means that we are all human beings. So whatever that I legitimately think that I should have, others can also aspire to have, and they also have every right. That is justice for all is a very important aspect of humanism. When we talk about spirit of inquiry and reform, we are looking at issues where, because of our cultural baggage or some historical aspects, some rights are restricted for certain underprivileged section, be it women, be it Dalits, be it minorities, whatever. Okay, various underprivileged sections are denied certain rights. So when we talk about spirit of inquiry and reform, we are talking about that, right? So in a way, if you look at it, in terms of public rationality and public sphere and public policy, the aspect of scientific temper, humanism, and spirit of inquiry are interconnected. And one of the important aspect of the scientific temper, there are many others, is knowledge. Because when we talk about public rationality, we are talking about certain kind of knowledge which we are all can accept as acceptable, right? So when do we accept? Only when we can really clearly say that how we came to acquire that knowledge, and second, whether the evidence that we have collected through such procedures warrant such a claim, right? So these two are central to public rationality. That's where I think the science education per se comes into picture. In this perception, science is a method. It's not a list of facts. Okay, it's not some list of facts, but it's a method. It's a method. The process of science, I think, is one important aspect that should be part of our science teaching. So, of course, there is a very old Tamil film in which the protagonist will be preparing to write a essay on coconut tree, but when he went to the question would be on cow. So he will write what all he has studied about coconut tree, and in the end, he will say that it is this coconut tree to which the cow is tied, and then he will complete his essay on cow. And similarly, I'm going to link whatever I said now to the title in the poster. So if you look at the role of teachers in scientific temper, if you are a science teacher, try to bring in the scientific method and process, not just only facts. Okay, so that way, I mean, you can instill certain amount of scientific temper, perception about scientific temper. Of course, this is not only about science; it's also about history. It's also about in almost any subject that is a matter of study in school. So here I use the science in a very broad sense rather than purely chemistry, physics, and biology. Whether it is history, how do we know about it? Okay, so what are the kind of evidences that history has before it? Maybe archaeological evidences, maybe epigraphical evidences, maybe there are some works that survey from that time. Okay, so put together, we are making certain kind of inferences, right? That's what history is in a way, kind of abduction, right? So can we bring this into school, classroom, at least to small extent? Of course, one of the main tasks as a school teacher would be to fulfill certain demands from certain groups who are also stakeholders in this education system. Parents, for example, educational authorities, for example. I'm not saying that you can completely disregard them. You may have to balance, but in this balance, can we as teachers bring this aspect into school education? That's something that I earnestly suggest that we should ponder. Uh, that's how I see that by bringing knowing into classroom, not just remembering, not just memorizing, not just repeating because I am a teacher, I told you, so you accept it, but knowing in a very deep sense into classroom, at least in few aspects, that we can really build scientific temper in this country. Thank you.
Your TV. That was typical TV's lecture. Very interesting, engaging, and always with some food for thought. I would like to start off with one question, and then Mr. Satish also has another question. You used a very powerful method of storytelling to build a narrative and then kind of drive home a point. Somehow our science education today is actually missing, or even mathematics education today actually misses that storytelling. Do you think they are crucial parts of bringing in this education of process or the nature of science itself through storytelling?
Yes, very much so. I think, see, what has happened in between is that, of course, there is also genuine reasons for it. But one problem is that certain stakeholders, I believe, got completely upper hand in the recent past in education, are also seeing such kind of upper hand in the recent period, which is passing competitive exam. Okay. But let's say, I mean, let's also be seeing it from the other side. I mean, it's always important that we don't see only from our shoes, but see from others' perception also. Say, suppose if I'm coming from a Dalit family and my parents have put in a lot of effort to send me to school, what do they want from me? They want a better life, which was denied to them and to their forefathers and foremothers for generations together. So, of course, one of the uppermost thing in their mind would be that I pass some competitive exam. So that's the only way today in this country that we can get into some position, right? So I won't say that completely reject it or laugh at it, but that alone is not education. That is, let us be very clear about it. Okay. So at least as educational policy makers, educationists, teachers, we should be able to balance them. Yes, that's a very important concept to keep in mind, but balance it. That's why I always go for this balancing. I won't say that every class run like this. It's impossible. Can you bring in some element? Maybe 5 times in a year?
Thank you. Satish sir, your question.
uh, the role of teachers in developing scientific temper. What is required is the people who have to liberate the students from the clutches of blind beliefs. They themselves should not be chained. The problem with the present set of science teachers is that we ourselves are chained. uh, we do not know the history of science. For example, the illustration that you gave about the discovery of infrared rays is actually going to the way it was discovered. So teachers generally lack in the history of science, how these concepts were evolved, ideas were evolved. What are those impediments in your view that are coming in the way of development of scientific tempers, apart from the one which I mentioned?
Okay, let me start with my own one little story. I'm sure all of us, again in school, we would have studied Kepler's law. Okay, the very first Kepler's law says that all planets go around the sun in elliptical orbit. How the hell Kepler found it? I mean, he cannot take a spacecraft, go to the space, sit there for some 500 years and observe planets going around. It's not possible, right? I mean, there was no spacecraft in those days. He was in a jail, in fact. Okay, he was in a prison. So from the prison, he was making some observation and came to this conclusion. So this question was in my mind for many years. I did not find the answer in one day. Quest. I think as long as we have quest, we will have scientific temper. It's not about the answer. In most of the time, the journey matters, not the destination. And in many places, I quote this quote from Rabindranath Tagore. It appears that somebody went and asked Rabindranath Tagore who is the best teacher. Apparently, Rabindranath Tagore is supposed to have said that any teacher who has passion, it doesn't matter even if it is stamp collection. Okay. So the point is that that passion is what is important. And as teachers, we have the opportunity to have our passion. Let's assume Sastriji is here. Sorry, Sastriji. Suppose you are a bank employee, you are in cashier. What passion you can have? Can you say that today I'm going to go and count 1 crore rupees? That's not going to be a passion, right? It's a very mundane job that you have to go and do, but of course it's a job that needs to be done. Okay, that's a different issue. But the point is that there is nothing joy that you can get out of many of the jobs. But teacher, a nurse, we are all different, right? I mean, you can have a certain fulfillment which cannot come from any other job. A teacher has this great potential if we use it. So you can be a clerk. So you can come to the classroom, whatever notes that you prepared 10 years ago, you can just vomit it and go away. You will be lifeless. Or you can come and say that, okay, one more opportunity. There is one more set of students. Let me think of some new way of talking about it. Then you have your life. So you can get life if you want, if you have a passion. So have passion, have some quest, search for it. It's not about finding the right answer that is the most important stuff. Don't worry. There are so many questions for which nobody knows right answer even today. Doesn't matter. Okay. The quest matters.
Thank you, sir.
Just have a follow-up question in one sense. You spoke briefly about this being, incorporated into the constitution as a fundamental duty. Then the need to foster, the spirit of inquiry and scientific temper and all that. And uh, we seem to be doing it. The policies seem to be, focusing on that, all that. But we're still, grappling with the same question. In terms across sectors, across, we still are grappling with the same question, that we still need to foster scientific. I think you touched upon various things briefly, but at a policy level, or at an execution level, where is there any particular reason, or a few reasons that you think where we seem to have faltered, or where we seem to have not done the right things in terms of ensuring
Okay.
that this happens?
See, candidly, if I have to speak, that most of the policy talks about scientific temper, etc., purely as ornamental. They don't really mean when they come to the implementation part. So it's all there in the first few paragraph, first few pages of policy document. But when they talk about brass tack, what exactly will be the reforms that will happen, there is no relation to the reference to scientific temper in any of those places. Okay, so that's that's unfortunately one of the hallmark of how we as society we are behaving. What we preach and what we practice, there is a huge chasm. That's one thing about policy, if I want to say so. Second, education is a social phenomena, so that I think we should accept. So when it is a social phenomena, there are multiple actors, and each actor have their own views and priorities. That also we need to accept humbly. Whatever be my position, most certainly that there are also other stakeholders who have certain other views about education. So the ultimate is a kind of a balance that comes in. So when I look at it purely as a teacher, so what can I do within a certain domain that is within me? Yes, there is a space. Because inside classroom, when you are there for that 45 minutes, nobody is checking you minute to minute as of now, thankfully. Of course, there are still schools which have come so-called high-tech, where they have put a video camera and apparently the principal is supposed to watch. God save them. For that, at least I hope that there are gods, not just one, but many. But coming to thing, I mean, most of the schools that where we are, we actually are the kings and queens once we enter into the classroom, right? So use that judiciously, use that creatively. We can make a difference. We can make a difference.
Thank you. I think Radhika Srinivas had a question. Please go ahead.
Madam, I think you are muted. I think you need to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
You're not audible.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you. Very good presentation, doctor.
Thank you.
So just wanted to ask one query which has been there for a long time. See, young children are already inherently scientists. They show a lot of scientific temper. They are very observant, and they experiment and all of that. But by the time they are 8 years, it's all gone. It's all crushed and gone, and then they are into facts. And I think I don't have to tell this. So how can we see, although the early years teachers, early years educators are trained to do some very hands-on things, somehow we all fall trap to this whole thing about science being a subject, and facts are important and all of that. So how can this transition from the early years to the primary years be ironed out, so that the children continue to have the scientific temper, and then the science teachers can take it up very easily from there?
Yeah, I can answer this question, but only one request to all participants: please don't tell anyone that I told this answer, which is be a rebel, sabotage. When you enter into classroom, nobody knows what you are doing inside the classroom. Sabotage. See, the system is wanting you to stick to communicating facts. System wants you to communicate factoid, not even factoids. Okay, memorization. Yes, they're all there. I mean, that pressure is there. But as I say, once you enter into your classroom, you are autonomous. Once you realize that you are autonomous, you can sabotage to an extent. Do that. That's just the only way. All this big talk about we'll have another new education policy, another, I don't believe that that's going to happen that simply. The change in this particular area, if it has to come, it has to come from classroom. And if it has to be led, it has to be led by teachers. And teachers can do. That's it.
Yeah.
And teachers are doing. I can at least list you about 100 teachers who are doing this. But never say that you are sabotaging. Keep silent. So you do it underneath, it will happen.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
TV has just demonstrated how to sabotage.
Yes.
With the title being different from his talk. Okay, I have one quick question. There are several teachers who are here, and many times we are usually at loss of words when students have questions for which we wouldn't have thought of, we wouldn't have come prepared for. How do we address such questions? One thing. The second thing, when we go on searching for such answers, Google Amma can't be the only source. Where all do we go?
Yeah. Okay. First point, I'll take it, which is, I think, a very important psychological problem that many teachers have to come out of, which is that you need not know answer for everything. In fact, remember that there is nobody in the world that who knows answer for everything. And there can be never anybody that who knows answer for everything. That's impossible. So let's start with that premise that it's not necessary that when a student asks you a question, you need to answer. There is nothing wrong in saying, I don't know, or let's find out together. Do we have a time for a minute story?
Yes. Yeah.
I suppose so. Okay. This is a story that my maths teacher told me when I was in my 10th standard. So this story is about Vivekananda and Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. Apparently, Vivekananda was a Nastik, and then he came to Paramahamsa and said that if you have seen God, show me the God. Okay. Apparently, Paramahamsa's answer is no, I have not seen the God. I am searching for it. Please join me. Let us search together. I think this story has a very important connotation for education. It is the search that which we need to take the students along with us. If you have to say that earth is spherical, the students don't need you or me. They need you and me. If you are going to say that, how do we know that it is spherical and not some other shape? Right? So I think that's an important point. So whenever a student asks such a question, think it as an opportunity rather than as a challenge. That's a important point. Okay. Convert it into a project and say that I'm not going to answer. Let's all find out. So even if you don't know, you can cover it up. Doesn't matter. Okay. That's number one. About your second question, what was the second question? Sorry, I lost.
How do we search for an answer?
Oh,
Google
that's an
can't do
important
that.
point. How do we search for an answer? Okay. Search for an answer. First thing that we should remember is we need to do a lot of work on this. I assure you, to find out where the library is. I think most of us won't know where the library is in the school, where the library is in your town or city, or where is the nearest place where there is a library. Please go there. Okay, libraries, of course, are contagious place. Once you go there, I mean, you will get a particular disease of what you can call as a book reading virus will enter into you. But that's okay. Okay, so go. That's how you find answers. Again, as I said, the search is the important stuff, not the answer. Finding answer is one of the simplest things that we can do today. You know, I mean, with the Google, I mean, it's not very difficult to find answer, but that's not the joy. The joy is discovering the answer. So discover it. That's more interesting.
Great. I have one more question. There is so much discussion around scientific temper, like you mentioned. Almost all the policies do talk about it. No one seems to disagree with whether we require scientific temper or not. But our own interpretation of what is scientific temper, or what are we inculcating it or not, I think there are huge differences.
Yeah.
So how do we draw a boundary saying that this is what we mean by scientific temper, and this is how we would maybe assess whether we are actually doing our job or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important question. I mean, this has two aspects to it. First aspect, I will take it. How do we understand what scientific temper is? Okay, so if you go by the Constitution, I mean, you look at those four key words there: scientific temper, humanism, spirit of inquiry, and reform. Okay, so these four keywords are coming together. They are sticking together. They are interacting with each other. They are speaking to each other. That tells you how to interpret this. Okay, that's I think number one. That's how I would suggest that we should go about interpreting it. It's not about knowledge of most modern science. That's not scientific temper. It is not, let's say, following a particular philosophy or not following a particular philosophy is scientific temper. This interconnection is what is scientific temper. It's about how we live with various people having different views. How do we live as a collective society without trampling on each other? That's, I think, the central key point. I have certain strong views. That's different. That's my view. Okay, so leaving that aside. Coming to measurement, which is, I think, one issue that comes in, and that clearly shows that Praveen is an engineer. Well, there are a lot of things in this world which are not measurable in the same way. For example, love is not something that is measurable. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, or it's not something that we cannot practice. Okay, so I believe this scientific temper is also a yatho, attitude, rather than something that can be actually measured or filled in. So I mean, there have been some debates. This is my view. Of course, I'm willing to debate that, but that's my view.
Thank you.
I think there's one of the questions. One of the questions that we constantly think about is, in the spirit of inquiry. Often it's, at least in my personal experience, I've seen that it helps to be not too prepared before you go into to face an audience or something. So in that context, how much do you think teachers should spend in preparing for a class, or should they have a loosely defined boundary under which they should go in, and in the same spirit of inquiry explore this together with the classroom?
Yeah. See, when we talk about spirit of inquiry, we are talking about how we are willing to question our beliefs. Okay, we are willing to say that some of them can be prejudice. Okay, so the spirit of inquiry is essentially that. let's say, for example, women. Okay, in this society in India, in most of the places, not most of the places, not all places. For example, Manipur is not falling into this particular framework that I'm going to talk about. Most of the or certain parts of Kerala in ancient time also was not falling into this. Like, for example, we were of the opinion that women need not get educated, or even if they get educated, they need not get higher education. Even if they get higher education, they need not do research. Even if they do research, they need not work. Blah 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 blah. Okay. So this is some kind of a view that some of us might carry. Are we willing to question this? That's the spirit of reform. Okay. It's a self question. It's not about you questioning somebody else. You are questioning about yourself. That's where the reform spirit of inquiry comes in, right? So, and then based on that inquiry, are you willing to reform yourself? That is, we as human beings have an opportunity to become better and better. We have a human being have an opportunity to grow. Are we willing to do this? That's what I think essentially that is asking, both at individual level as social level.
One last question. I think this has come up twice in the chat box, so I'll ask that. I think one of the questions, I just frame it slightly differently. I think one of the questions that has come up is that in our quest for being rational, being only experimentation and all of that, are we in a sense denying the validity of things that what is classically called traditional, I think, and the value of experiential knowing as opposed to only experimental observational understanding? I just reframe the question that's come.
Yeah, I got your point, but that is where I was pointing out that there is a public sphere and there is a private sphere.
Correct.
As a private sphere, I may believe that, for example, in Tamil Nadu, there is a saying that every Saturday you have to have oil bath. Okay, but I don't think anybody in Iceland has ever done oil bath. They have put oil on their head and then taken bath, right? So, is it wrong to take oil bath? No, that's my private belief. But can I have a public policy that if somebody doesn't do it, that I look down upon that person or exclude that person from social public, or what will be the public policy? Will I have a health, let's say, policy demanding that every citizen should take oil bath on every Saturday? That's where I'm talking about. There is some private life and there is a public sphere. Let's not mix it up. So when you are talking about experiential, I may say that my experiential belief is so and so, but that may not be yours. So what is common for us when we come to public policy or public rationality or public decision making? It can be only where both of us can agree. That can be only things which are demonstrable in public arena, right? As public rationality. That's the whole point. So what is your private life? How you live it? Largely, it's your choice. Okay, but as how we will live is our choice. Both of them are not same.
Dr. Venkateshwar, that was a fantastic way of answering that question, and really a good point to lead into our closing. So your final closing remarks, and then Dr. Satish should also be.
Okay, so with gray hairs, I'm supposed to give generally some advice to people because most of you are young people, right? So I'll take that, don that particular character and then give two advices. Number one, never be educated. Educated is past tense. Please be educating, present continuous. Okay, so that's number one. Most of us think that once we complete our studies, we are educated. That's enough. We are also saying we have completed our studies. Studies can never complete. Okay, so be constantly learning something new. That is number one, which is I think very important for all teachers and educationists. Second is that 45 minutes is yours. Sabotage. Thank you.
It was an excellent presentation, sir, on scientific temper, although you started in a different way. Finally, it converged onto the topic, and I would like to place on record our sincere thanks. The problem, as I mentioned earlier, is that the science teachers themselves think that science is a set of facts. I think that there is a need to undo this. I don't know how it can be done, but there is an urgent need to orient the teachers either during their teacher preparation program or during in-service programs or during such interactions, that the processes of science are as important or more important than the facts of science. So not that facts of science are irrelevant, but the way of thinking and the way knowledge is generated in science and accepted into the body of knowledge is not highly appreciated by most of the teachers. And I think that's one of the problems with the existing system. Anyway, it was a very thought-provoking lecture. I on behalf of Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement, would like to place on record our most sincere thanks for a lucid presentation and very thought-provoking lecture. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end of yet another edition of Guru Manthan. We'll continue to bring this going forward. And I would like to again, thank all of the participants, Dr. Venkateswaran. I think it needs to be said again. I think this was a fabulous way of, I was thinking, we're talking about scientific temper, and the whole thing, the way it was brought up was excellent. Thank you once again. Thank you to all the participants who have continued to come and, who have engaged, who continue to send your feedback and thoughts. Thank you once again. And we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did in bringing this to you. And we look forward to meeting with you again next week. Thank you and have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. I'll also take leave. Thank you.